a freelance software developer from Provo, Utah, found his life's work claimed by a tech giant using a controversial new copyright clause. But his fight went national when Jasmine Crockett proved in a hearing that the clause was secretly inserted into a must-pass bill by Senator Mike Lee's office. The moment the C-SPAN clip hit social media, it was like putting a match to gasoline. Within minutes, the video timestamped to Crockett's final devastating line was everywhere. The hashtag corporate pirates started trending, immediately followed by hashtag gave them the getaway car. In the DC offices of the tech behemoth Nexus Innovations, a crisis communications team scrambled to formulate a response, but they were already hours behind the wave of public outrage. In Provo, the developer, Leo Castillo, watched his phone buzz itself off his kitchen table, the notifications a roaring tide of support that was as terrifying as it was validating. And in the House Judiciary Committee hearing room, staffers on both sides of the aisle looked on in stunned silence as the political order of the day was for a moment completely upended by a single, perfectly aimed accusation. 2 days earlier, the world was a much quieter, and for Leo Castillo, a much lonelier place. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his small apartment in Provo, the glow of his triple monitor setup casting long shadows that felt like physical representations of his despair. For 18 months, Leo had been living a nightmare. He was the sole creator of Pathfinder, a revolutionary data sorting algorithm that used a unique predictive model to organize massive, unstructured datasets with unparalleled speed and efficiency. It was his magnum opus, the culmination of 4 years of sleepless nights, sacrificed weekends, and a belief so pure it bordered on obsession. Then Nexus Innovations, a Utah-based tech unicorn, with a sprawling campus and an army of lawyers, had launched Nexus Sort, a product that was, line for line, a mirror of his own code. His initial cease and desist letter was met with a dismissive two-paragraph response from Nexus's legal department. The letter cited Section 217B of the recently passed American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. It was a dense sauce recipes then complex software had to read it 3 times before he understood its horrifying implication. The clause, buried deep within a 1,200-page bill, effectively stated that any software algorithm not attached to a hardware patent for commercial use, if the original creator had not achieved market saturation within 6 months of its demonstrable completion, it was a license to steal, gift-wrapped in patriotic language. They're calling it redevelopment. His lawyer, a man named Henderson, had said, his voice weary, "They claim your code was a demonstrable prototype, and since you didn't and couldn't get it into the market at a national scale, they were within their rights to build their own version for the good of the industry." It's ludicrous, but the language of the clause is just vague enough to be legally defensible. The lawsuit Leo filed was a financial drain he couldn't afford. Nexus's lawyers buried him in motions, discovery requests, and depositions designed to bleed him dry. His savings vanished. He took on freelance coding gigs just to pay his rent, working on mundane web forms and database updates, while the creation he considered his child was being marketed globally as someone else's triumph. The final insult came during a preliminary hearing when Nexus's lead counsel argued that Leo, a solo developer working from his apartment, lacked the resources to be a proper steward of such a vital technological asset. The judge, though sympathetic, admitted that the statute was the key, and its interpretation was a matter for a higher court. He poured his frustration and technical knowledge into a series of posts, dissecting Pathfinder's code and comparing it directly to Nexus Sort. He posted screenshots, flowcharts, and explained in excruciating detail how Nexus hadn't just copied his idea. They had lifted his architecture, his unique variable naming conventions, even the commented-out notes he'd left for himself in the source code. The posts gained some traction in niche coding communities on Reddit and Hacker News. People were angry on his behalf, but it was the anger of the powerless. It was 1,000 sympathetic murmurs in a canyon of corporate power. One night, drowning in debt and despair, he saw a clip of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on a late-night talk show. Precise, her logic inescapable, her indignation palpable. She was a former public defender. The host mentioned she knew what it was like to fight for the little guy. On a whim, fueled by coffee and desperation, Leo wrote an email. He didn't send it to the generic Contact Us form on her government website. He spent 2 hours figuring out the email address format for congressional staffers and sent a message directly to her legislative director, her chief of staff, and a junior legislative assistant, whose name he found on LinkedIn. The subject line was, "A Texas Congresswoman's help needed for a Utah coder robbed by federal law." In the body, he laid out his entire story, linking to his blog, the court documents, and the text of Section 217B. He didn't ask for money or legal help. He asked for one thing: please, just make them answer for this law. He hit send and, expecting nothing, fell into a fitful sleep. In Washington, D.C., 48 hours before the hearing, Jasmine Crockett's legislative director, a sharp, perpetually stressed man named Marcus Vance, was doing his final triage. Utah coder screamed, "Not our jurisdiction." But the subject line was just intriguing enough. He opened it. He read the first paragraph, then the second. He clicked the link to the blog. An hour later, he was standing in Crockett's office doorway. "Jasmine, you need to see this," he said. Holding his tablet, Crockett was on the phone with a county commissioner from Dallas, talking about funding for a new health clinic. She held up a finger, finished her call with a warm, "You fight for them down there, and I'll fight for them up here," and turned to Marcus. "What's so important it couldn't wait until morning?" A guy in Provo, Utah, software developer, AICA. That was that huge omnibus bill from last year. Who sponsored it? Primary sponsor was from the Senate side, a real grab bag of stuff. Marcus paused, swiping on the tablet. The language was submitted in committee by Senator Mike Lee's office. Crockett leaned forward, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Mike Lee, the constitutional scholar, the staunch conservative from Utah, and Nexus Innovations, she knew, was one of Utah's biggest corporate success stories and a major donor to Lee's campaigns. The pieces began to click into place, and this coder, he has proof. "He has more than proof," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement. "He has receipts, side-by-side code comparisons. The company didn't even bother to change his original comment notations. They were so confident in this legal shield Lee gave them, they didn't even try to hide it." Crockett took the tablet and spent the next 30 minutes silently reading. She saw the elegant, clean lines of his original code next to the carbon copy being sold by Nexus. She felt the cold corporate dismissal in the lawyer's letter. This wasn't just a legislative issue. It was a story of a person being crushed by a system designed to protect the powerful. It was the exact kind of fight that had drawn her to the law in the first place. The public defender in her stirred. The Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on intellectual property and competition policy on Wednesday, she said, her voice low and focused. "The witness list is already set. Innovation." She looked up at Marcus, her eyes hard. "Get me everything you can on Section 217B, the legislative history, who lobbied for it, every meeting Lee's office had on it, and get Mr. Castillo on the phone. I want to talk to him myself." Across town, Senator Mike Lee was the guest of honor. At a lavish dinner hosted at the home of Nexus CEO Julian Vance's chief lobbyist, the mood was self-congratulatory. They were celebrating a year of record profits, much of it driven by the phenomenal success of Nexus sort, Vance, a man with a tanned, perpetually relaxed face and eyes that never seemed to blink, raised a glass of wine that cost more than Leo Castillo's monthly rent. "To Senator Lee," Vance said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "A man who understands that for America to lead, we must untangle our innovators from the red tape and frivolous litigation that holds them back. He is a true champion of the free market." Lee smiled, a picture of senatorial confidence. He believed in the cause. To him, individual creators like Leo Castillo were sentimental distractions. The real engine of progress was capital, organized and deployed by corporations like Nexus. They were the ones creating jobs, pushing the economy forward. If a few hobbyists, as he would later call them, got their feelings hurt in the process, it was a small, necessary price for national greatness. He had no idea that a Texas congresswoman was, at that very moment, meticulously printing out the source code of a hobbyist from his own state, preparing to turn his legislative triumph into a national scandal. He felt secure, insulated by ideology and influence. He had no idea he was walking into an ambush. The call from Congresswoman Crockett's office had jolted Leo from his stupor. He spoke first to Marcus, then, to his astonishment, to the Congresswoman herself. Her voice was sharp, direct, and devoid of pity. It was better than pity. It was full of focused anger. She didn't make promises. She asked questions. Hard, technical questions about his code, about the timeline, about the law. He felt less like a victim and more like a key witness. "Mr. Castillo," Crockett said, her Texas accent coming through clearly over the phone, "I can't get you your money back, and I can't intervene in your court case. That's not my role. But what I can do is put the people who did this to you under oath and make them explain it to the American people on national television. Are you comfortable with that? It's going to get loud." Leo looked around his small apartment at the stacks of legal bills and the screen displaying the code he knew as well as his own reflection. Loud was better than the crushing silence he'd been living in. "Yes, Congresswoman," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in months. "It's time someone made some noise." The preparation in Crockett's office was a whirlwind. Her small team worked through the night. They dug up the lobbying disclosure forms, finding the Nexus lobbyist's name listed next to meetings about the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. They found articles in tech journals praising Mike Lee for his forward-thinking approach to intellectual property, all sponsored by a think tank that received the majority of its funding from Nexus and other tech giants. They created a timeline linking the lobbying efforts, the introduction of Section 217B, and the launch of Nexus Sort. It was a clean, damning chain of events. Crockett herself focused on the exhibits. She didn't just want to talk about the code, she wanted to show it. She had her staff print out huge blow-ups of key sections of Leo's Pathfinder code and Nexus's Sort code. She highlighted the identical structures, the copied comments, including one particularly damning one where Leo had written, "This is a weird fix, but it works. Don't touch it," which had been mindlessly copied verbatim into the corporate product. It was the kind of sloppy, arrogant mistake that a jury, or in this case, the court of public opinion, could understand perfectly. "We're not going to attack the CEO on legal theory," Crockett instructed her team as they gathered around, a table littered with coffee cups and printouts. "We're going to attack him on facts. He's a thief. And Senator Lee gave him the getaway car. Our job is to show everyone the keys." She tapped a thick binder in front of her. "It's all right here. We just have to lay it out, piece by piece." Her demeanor was calm, but her eyes held the intensity of a prosecutor about to deliver her closing argument. The trap was set. The morning of the hearing, the city of Washington, D.C. awoke to a familiar, humid haze. But inside Jasmine Crockett's apartment, the air was still and cool. She had been awake since 4:30 a.m., not out of nervousness, but out of habit. The habit of preparation. She ran 5 miles along the Anacostia River. Her playlist, a mix of 90s hip-hop that was less about motivation and more about rhythm. A steady beat to organize her thoughts. Back in her apartment, she didn't review the binder her staff had, meticulously prepared. She already knew its contents cold. Instead, she stood in front of a full-length mirror, a legal pad on a nearby table, and practiced her questioning. She wasn't memorizing a script, she was finding the cadence. She spoke the questions aloud, adjusting a word here, a phrase there, testing their weight. She was preparing for a performance, not in the theatrical sense, but in the way a surgeon prepares for a complex operation. Every move anticipated, every contingency planned for. Her focus was absolute. This wasn't just about one coder in Utah. It was about every person who had ever had their work, their life, their future, devalued by someone with more power and better lawyers. Thousands of miles away, in Provo, Leo Castillo was also awake. He hadn't slept at all. He sat in his desk chair, the same one he'd spent 4 years in while creating Pathfinder, and stared at the live feed of the empty Judiciary Committee room on his monitor. C-SPAN's feed was already up, a static shot of the polished wood dais and the empty leather chairs. For him, it felt like watching the arena before the gladiators entered. His apartment was clean, tidier than it had been in months. He had spent the previous day scrubbing, organizing, and throwing things away, a frantic burst of activity to keep his anxiety at bay. He had set up a second monitor with his blog's real-time analytics and a third with a private chat window open with Marcus, Crockett's legislative director. Marcus had prepped him. "She's going to show them your code. They're going to talk about you. It might be uncomfortable. Stay offline if you need to. Leo had typed back, I've been uncomfortable for 18 months. I'm not looking away now. Hope was a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling, and it was warring with a deep, conditioned dread. He drank his coffee black and waited for the proceedings to begin. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room in the Rayburn House office building began to fill shortly. Before 10 a.m., it was a space built for televised confrontation, tiered, seating for the members of Congress on a raised platform. A long table below for the witnesses and designated areas for the press. Their cameras and microphones a thicket of black metal and glass. Staffers bustled back and forth, placing glasses of water and stacks of documents. Jasmine Crockett arrived early. She chose her seat, laid out a single legal pad, 2 pens, and the thick binder of exhibits her team had prepared. She spoke quietly. With a few colleagues, her demeanor calm and professional, giving no hint of the bombshell she was about to drop. Then, Julian Vance, the CEO of Nexus Innovations, made his entrance. It was a performance in itself. He didn't just walk in, he swept in, flanked by 2 lawyers in identical dark suits and a young, impeccably dressed PR handler. Vance himself was dressed in the Silicon Valley CEO uniform, a tailored dark blazer over an expensive open-collared shirt. He exuded an aura of effortless success and frictionless power. He smiled, shook hands with the committee chairman, and took his seat at the witness table. He looked entirely at ease, as if he were about to give a keynote address at a tech conference rather than testify before Congress. He saw Crockett on the dais, but his gaze passed over her without a flicker of recognition. To him, she was just another politician, another face in the institutional architecture of a city he viewed as a necessary but tedious obstacle. The chairman, a senior Republican from Ohio named Jim Jordan, though in this context playing a more neutral role as committee lead, banged his gavel. The committee will come to order. Today, we are here to discuss the state of intellectual property rights in the digital age and how we can best foster American innovation. Our nation's prosperity has always been built on the ingenuity of our people and the strength of our laws protecting their creations. It is vital that we ensure those laws are fit for purpose in the 21st century. He gave a nod to the witness table. We have with us today Mr. Julian Vance, CEO of Nexus Innovations, a true leader in the field of data science. Mr. Vance, we welcome you. You are recognized for your opening statement. Vance leaned into the microphone, his movements practiced and smooth. Thank you, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, and distinguished members of the committee. It is an honor to be here today to discuss the future of American innovation, a future that my team at Nexus Innovations is proud to be building every single day. His voice was a carefully modulated baritone, the kind that sounded inherently reasonable. Through sheer brilliance and hard work, had become a global powerhouse. He talked about creating high-paying jobs in Utah, about repatriating tech talent from overseas, and about the Nexus ecosystem that supported hundreds of smaller businesses. Innovation is not a solitary pursuit, Vance continued, his eyes scanning the faces on the dais. It is a collaborative, dynamic process. It requires capital, it requires scale, and it requires a legal framework that prioritizes progress over protectionism. For too long, our country's most brilliant minds have been held back by a tangled web of outdated regulations and the threat of frivolous lawsuits from individuals who may have a good idea, but lack the vision or the resources to bring that idea to the global market where it can actually benefit society. In Provo, Leo felt a hot spike of anger. Frivolous lawsuits. Good idea. Vance was talking about him. He was preemptively dismissing him without ever having to say his name. Vance went on. The American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, particularly some of its forward-thinking provisions regarding software stewardship, was a monumental step in the right direction. It recognized a fundamental truth. Algorithms sitting unused on a single developer's laptop does nothing for the American economy. It is only when such an innovation is scaled, refined, and deployed by an enterprise with the means to do so that its true value is unlocked. Nexus was proud to redevelop a sorting concept and build it into the Nexus Sort platform, a tool now used by major logistics companies, healthcare networks, and even federal agencies to manage critical data. We didn't just build a product, we built an engine for American efficiency. He was using their sanitized language, stewardship, redevelop, unlocking value. He was casting his company as a public servant, taking a raw, unrefined idea and turning it into something useful for the world, conveniently omitting that the raw idea was a fully functional, elegant piece of software they had stolen whole. Cloth. He concluded his 5-minute statement with a flourish. To continue leading the world, America must choose to empower its champions of innovation. We must choose scale over sentiment, progress over the past. We must, in short, choose to win. Thank you. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. The room was quiet for a moment. He had framed the entire debate on his terms. A Republican congressman from California, a man whose district bordered Silicon Valley, was the first to ask a question. It was a textbook softball. Mr. Vance, thank you for that powerful testimony. Could you elaborate on how the Nexus ecosystem is helping small businesses in my state compete and grow? Vance smiled. An excellent question. What we do is provide our core platform, Nexus Sort, to smaller logistics and supply chain startups at a reduced rate. This allows them to compete with established giants. We see ourselves as lifting the entire tide. He went on for several minutes, a river of smooth, plausible-sounding corporate synergy. Next, a Democrat from New York asked a slightly more challenging question about whether Nexus's market dominance could stifle competition. Vance was ready. On the contrary, he countered smoothly, our success inspires competition. It sets a high bar that pushes everyone in the field to be better, to be more innovative. We don't shrink the pie, we grow it. He deflected the question, without ever engaging its premise, like a matador sidestepping a bull. Leo watched, his heart sinking. Vance was untouchable. He was too polished, too prepared. The system was working exactly as it was designed to, protecting him and his company. He typed a frantic message to Marcus. He's twisting it all. They're believing him. Marcus replied almost instantly. Breathe, Leo. This is part of the process. Wait for it. On the dais, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She didn't fidget or take notes. She just watched Julian Vance, her expression unreadable. She let the other members use their time. She listened to Vance's slick evasions, his confident non-answer. She was giving him room, letting him build his own pedestal higher and higher, knowing that the taller it was, the more spectacular the fall would be. Finally, after about 30 minutes of questioning, the chairman glanced down his list. His eyes fell on Crockett. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, is now recognized for 5 minutes. This was the moment. In Provo, Leo leaned so close to his monitor that his breath fogged the screen. In the hearing room, Vance gave Crockett a brief, almost condescendingly, patient smile, straightened his blazer, and took a sip of water. Preparing for another routine 5 minutes of questioning, he had no idea what was coming. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. She didn't thank him for his testimony. She didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. Her first question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Mr. Vance, she began, her voice calm and clear. What is a weird fix? Julian Vance blinked. The question was so far outside the expected parameters of Beltway discourse that it seemed like a non sequitur. His brain, primed for queries about market capitalization and competitive strategy, momentarily stalled. He looked at Crockett, a slight bemused frown on his face, as if she had asked him for the square root of a color. I'm sorry, Congresswoman, he said, his smooth baritone carrying a hint of condescension. Could you repeat the question? Certainly, Crockett said, her voice even. I asked, what is a weird fix? Vance glanced toward his lawyers, who were seated directly behind him. They gave an infinitesimal shrug. It was his hearing. He turned back to the microphone. In the context of software development, that could mean any number of things, an unconventional solution to a coding problem. Perhaps. It's not a standard industry term. He was trying to frame it as technical jargon she wouldn't understand. So it's not a term your highly trained professional developers at Nexus Innovations would typically use in their formal source code documentation, Crockett pressed. Our standards for code annotation are rigorous, Vance said, puffing up slightly, back on what he thought was solid ground. Everything is documented professionally, clearly, and in a way that allows for seamless collaboration. Across our global teams, we pride ourselves on our professionalism. Professionalism, I see, Crockett said, making a small note on her pad. And this rigorous professional process, does it involve code reviews, peer assessments to ensure quality and originality? Of course, Vance said. Nexus runs a multi-layered review process. No line of code goes into a final product without being vetted by a team of senior engineers. It's a core part of our intellectual property integrity protocol. Intellectual property integrity protocol. Crockett repeated the phrase slowly, letting it hang in the air. That sounds impressive. She turned to the committee clerk. Mr. Clerk, would you please display Exhibit A on the monitors? The large screens behind the dais, previously showing the C-SPAN logo, flickered to life. They now displayed a block of text, source code, dense and cryptic to the uninitiated, but clean and well-structured. Double quotes, Mr. Vance, do you recognize this code? Crockett asked. Vance squinted at the screen. It appears to be a sorting algorithm of some kind. I don't recognize it specifically. We generate millions of lines of code at Nexus. It was a truthful evasion. This specific code is from a program called Pathfinder, Crockett stated. It was written by a software developer from Provo, Utah, named Leo Castillo. Are you familiar with Mr. Castillo? A flicker of something annoyance, recognition, crossed Vance's face before being suppressed. The name is vaguely familiar. I believe he is involved in some baseless litigation against my company. Baseless litigation, Crockett echoed. Let's talk about that. Mr. Clerk, please display Exhibit B, the screen split. On the left was Leo Castillo's Pathfinder code. On the right, a new block of code appeared under the heading Nexus Sort. Even to the layman in the room, the similarity was jarring. The structure, the spacing, the flow, they were virtually identical. A low murmur went through the press section, however, remained calm. He had been prepped for this. Congresswoman, with all due respect, what you're seeing is what we call convergent development. In any specialized field, there are often only one or two optimal solutions to a given problem. It is not surprising that two talented teams of engineers working on the same challenge would arrive at a similar or even identical structural solution. It happens all the time. Convergent development. Another impressive-sounding phrase, Crockett said. So your talented team of engineers just happened to convergently develop the exact same solution as a single man working in his apartment, a man whose work you had previously evaluated in a confidential private demonstration. Vance's jaw tightened. Our team develops our products independently. We are innovators. Let's talk about that innovation, Crockett said, her voice sharpening. Mr. Clerk, please zoom in on line 482 of both exhibits. The text on the screens magnified. There, in both blocks of code, was a comment line and note left by the programmer. On the left, in Leo's code, the line read, "This is a weird fix, but it works. Don't touch it." While on the right, in the source code for the billion-dollar Nexus Sort platform, was the exact same line, copied verbatim. "This is a weird fix, but it works. Don't touch it, lol." The room fell completely silent. The three letters low hung in the air like a confession. It was a digital fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. The sloppy, human, undeniable evidence of a copy-paste job. In Provo, Leo Castillo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for 18 months. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Vance stared at the screen. The blood drained from his face. His carefully constructed facade of corporate polish and intellectual superiority shattered in an instant. This, his lawyers had not prepped him for. This was not about legal theory. It was about blatant, embarrassing theft. He sputtered, turning. To his lawyers behind him, his eyes wide with panic, they could offer him nothing but stricken looks. They were lawyers, not magicians. Mr. Vance Crockett's voice cut through his panic, sharp as a scalpel. Is LOL part of Nexus's intellectual property integrity protocol? Is that the kind of rigorous professional annotation your senior engineers typically use? It's an anomaly, Vance stammered, his voice losing its baritone smoothness, becoming thin and reedy. A rogue employee, a rogue employee. Crockett shot back. her voice rising in volume and intensity. Or was it a rogue company, Mr. Vance? A company so confident that it had the law on its side that it didn't even bother to hide the evidence of its crime. A company that felt entitled to take the life's work of a man because you had a senator in your pocket to write you a permission slip. The chairman banged his gavel, but Crockett wasn't. Looking at the chairman, her eyes were boring into Julian Vance. Let's talk about that permission slip, Mr. Vance. It's called Section 217B of the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. Did your lobbyists write that clause for you? We provide input on legislation that affects our industry. That is our right, Vance said, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. Did you meet with Senator Mike Lee's staff to discuss the specific language of that clause? Language that just happened to perfectly describe Mr. Castillo's situation as single developer, not yet at market scale? Senator Lee is a champion of innovation. He's the senator from your state, a state where you are one of the largest employers and political donors. Crockett was nearly shouting now, the righteous anger of a public defender in her voice. Did he give you this law so you could retroactively legalize your theft? This is not theft, Vance insisted, his voice cracking. She stood up, something rarely done during a 5-minute questioning period. The other had nexuses. She held them up, one in each hand, turning not to Vance, but to the bank of press cameras at the back of the room. The lenses ensuring she was speaking to everyone watching at home. This isn't competition, she said, her eyes blazing. It was a getaway car for corporate pirates. The room erupted. The chairman was banging his gavel repeatedly, his calls for order completely lost in the chaos. Jasmine Crockett placed the 2 boards down gently on the dais. She looked at the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions for this witness, she said calmly. I yield back my time. She sat down, took a sip of water, and began making neat, precise notes on her legal pad as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The hearing was, for all intents and purposes, over. The truth was out. The getaway car had been crashed, its driver exposed, in front of the entire world, and the viral storm was just beginning. Jasmine Crockett gathered her papers with deliberate calm, stacking them into a neat pile. She slid the binder and her legal pad into a leather portfolio. All around her, the hearing room remained a vortex of noise and motion. Julian Vance had been practically carried out by his lawyers, his face a ghostly white mask. The committee chairman, flustered and angry, had gavelled the hearing into an early recess. Reporters, unable to get to Vance, now swarmed toward the dais, shouting Crockett's name. She ignored them, then stood and walked purposefully toward the exit behind the dais. The same way she had come in, she didn't run, she didn't rush. The moment she was out of the room, the digital world, which operates faster than any gavel, had already rendered its verdict. The clip of her final 30 seconds of questioning was the single most shared video on every platform. On Twitter, #CorporatePirates, #GetawayCar, and #WeirdFixLol were the top 3 trending topics in the United States and were climbing the global charts. The stock price of Nexus Innovations, a titan of the market, just that morning. The company's carefully curated image as a benign innovator had been irrevocably torched. Senator Mike Lee's office released a hastily written statement calling the story was no longer about a dry intellectual property hearing. His blog, which had previously celebrated a good day if it got a few hundred hits, had received over 2 million page views in an hour, crashing his server twice. His personal email inbox was a cascading waterfall of messages. There were hundreds. From fellow software developers sharing their own stories of corporate overreach, there were dozens of messages from journalists at every major news outlet. And then there were the emails that made him stop and stare. Messages from partners at 3 of the most powerful litigation firms in the country. They weren't just offering to help. They were competing to represent him, pro bono. One email read, Mr. Castillo, we believe you have a compelling case for damages. We are prepared to put our firm's full resources at your disposal. 18 months of being told his case was baseless had been reversed in 5 minutes of televised testimony. He pushed his chair back from his desk, stood up, and walked to the window of his apartment. He looked out at the Wasatch Mountains, the familiar peaks that had been the silent witnesses to his long struggle. For the first time in a very long time, the crushing weight on his chest was gone. He was still the same man, in the same apartment. But everything was different. He was no longer a victim. He was a cause. The adrenaline that had sustained Jasmine Crockett through the hearing and its immediate aftermath began to wane as she walked through the quiet marbled halls of the Rayburn building back toward her own office. By the time she stepped through the door, a deep cellular exhaustion had begun to set in. Her staff erupted in applause, their faces beaming with pride and excitement. "You were incredible, Jasmine," Marcus said, his voice buzzing. "The phones are ringing off the hook. CNN, MSNBC, everyone wants you on tonight." Crockett managed a tired smile. "We'll decide on that later. Marcus, first, I need a minute." She sank into her chair, the leather groaning in protest. She closed her eyes, and for a full minute, she just breathed. The fight was won, but fights always leave scars. The public saw the triumphant warrior. They didn't see the years of training it took to land that single perfect blow. They didn't see the cost of living in a state of constant readiness, the toll that absorbing so much of the world's injustice takes on a person's soul. Her communications director knocked and gently opened the door. "Congresswoman, sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." He held out a tablet, his face grim. The screen showed the social media monitoring software her office used. It was a sea of red. Alongside the millions of supportive messages were thousands of others, a toxic sludge of pure hatred. They were organized, vicious, and deeply personal. Racist slurs were flung at her with casual brutality. There were detailed, violent threats. One user had posted a picture of her office building, with the caption, "We know where you work." Another had written, "Someone needs to shut this loudmouth **** up for good." This was the other side of the viral coin. She scrolled through it, her face a stoic mask, but inside, cold, not tightened in her stomach. This was the price. Later that evening, after declining all media requests for the night, she was in her apartment eating a simple salad over the sink when her personal cell phone rang. The screen read, "Mom." A wave of both comfort and apprehension washed over her. She knew this call was coming. She took a deep breath and answered, "Hi, Mama." Jasmine Felicia Crockett. Her mother's voice came through the line, a familiar blend of southern warmth and unshakable strength. "Don't you hi Mama me? I saw you on the news. I saw what you did. I hope you are proud," Jasmine said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Proud, honey? I nearly burst. You stood up there and you spoke truth to power like you were born to do it. You reminded me of your father arguing in front of that city council back home." There was a pause. When her mother spoke again, the pride was still there, but it was laced with a tremor of fear. "But I also saw the things they're saying about you online. My neighbor showed me on her computer the things they're calling you, the threats. Jasmine, Mama, it's just words." "It's what they do when they're losing," Jasmine said, her own voice softer than it had been all day. "Words can be bullets, waiting for a gun," her mother retorted, her voice sharp with worry. "I know you're strong. I raised you to be strong. But you're still my baby girl, and I worry. Does your security know about this? Are you being careful?" "Yes, Mama. The Capitol Police are aware. My staff is tracking it. I'm being careful, I promise." She was, but the reassurance felt thin even to her own ears. How could you be careful? Enough against such a vast, amorphous cloud of hate. "You did a good thing for that young man in Utah," her mother said, her voice softening again. "You gave him his voice back. Don't ever stop doing that. But you remember to take care of yourself. You hear me? You can't fight for anyone if you let them wear you down to nothing." "I hear you, Mama. I love you. I love you more. Now, Ita, real dinner? You sound tired." After the call, Jasmine stood in her quiet apartment, the distant sound of city sirens, a faint cry in the night. The conversation had anchored her. Her mother's fear was a mirror of her own, but her pride was a shield. The threats were real. The exhaustion was profound, but the purpose, the reason she endured it, all was clearer than ever. It was for the Leo Castillos. It was for her father arguing before the city council. It was for everyone who had ever been told to sit down and be quiet. Meanwhile, in a conference room on the Senate side of the Capitol, the mood was funereal. Senator Mike Lee stood at the head of a table, his face a thunderous mask. His chief of staff, his press secretary, and his legislative director all avoided his gaze. They had the numbers on a screen. Lee's personal approval rating in Utah had taken a double-digit hit in the last 8 hours, according to Snap polls. The phones in his state offices were overwhelmed, and the callers were not supportive. He was supposed to be prepared. Lee finally exploded, slamming his hand on the table. Vance was supposed to be untouchable. How did he let her corner him? With a low, he got arrogant. Senator, his chief of staff said timidly. He walked into a trap he never saw coming, and Crockett, she was ready for him. She's a freshman House member, a professional agitator. Lee spat. She's not a serious legislator. Well, she's being treated like one tonight, sir, the press secretary said, scrolling through her phone. The narrative is set. She's the hero. You're the villain who wrote the getaway car clause. Lee paced the room, his mind racing. An apology or a retraction was out of the question. It would be admitting guilt, weakness. In the modern Republican Party, that was a death sentence. There was only one path forward. Get me on Fox News, he commanded, his voice cold with renewed purpose. I want Hannity tonight if possible. This isn't about some coder's hurt feelings. This is a radical progressive attacking the very foundations of American free enterprise. She's not a hero. She's a socialist trying to destroy one of our country's great companies with lies and theatrics. We're not going to defend. We're going to attack. We're going to change the story. He was a cornered animal, and he was about to prove just how dangerous that could be. The Fox News primetime broadcast began with its signature bombastic opening. And then there was Senator Mike Lee, seated opposite the host, his expression a mask of sober concern. The counterattack was swift and predictable. He didn't defend the specifics of the Nexus case. He went broader, painting the entire incident as a symptom of a dangerous political sickness. What we saw in that hearing, Lee said, his voice resonating with sincerity, was not a search for truth. It was a calculated act of political theater by a radical, progressive member of Congress who is fundamentally opposed to the American system of free enterprise. The host nodded gravely. She seemed to be attacking not just this one company, Senator, but the very idea that businesses can and should be successful. Precisely, Lee agreed. Nexus Innovations is a great American company that employs thousands of my constituents and is on the front lines of our economic competition with China. This congresswoman from Texas, who has a 100% rating from the Democratic Socialists of America, would rather tear down a successful company to score cheap political points than see America win. Section 217B, the clause she so dishonestly maligned, is about ensuring that vital technology doesn't languish on a hobbyist's laptop. It's about national security. It's about speed to market. It is a pro-American, pro-innovation piece of legislation, and I will not apologize for it. For the next 10 minutes, they constructed an alternate reality. Leo Castillo was diminished. To a disgruntled litigant, Jasmine Crockett was a performative, clout-chasing politician. The hearing was a kangaroo court. To the millions watching, the narrative was successfully muddied. The clear-cut case of theft was now just another partisan squabble, another episode in the endless culture war. In Washington, the debate pivoted. News cycles that had been focused on corporate malfeasance were now dominated by discussions of Crockett's socialist agenda versus Lee's pro-business patriotism. Crockett's office was frustrated. They were spending their time refuting bad faith arguments instead of building on their victory. Momentum was stalling. And then, the unexpected ally emerged from the one corner of the internet they had feared. The most Declan Reed was a legend in the tech world. His blog, The Silicon Individualist, and his weekly podcast were gospel for a massive audience of coders, venture capitalists, and tech libertarians who were deeply skeptical of government and fiercely devoted to free market ideals. Reed was a purist. He hated government regulation, but he hated government-granted privilege, cronyism even more. He was typically a natural ally of Mike Lee. 2 weeks after the hearing, Reed published a post titled, "On Getaway Cars and Rigged Races, Why Mike Lee is Dangerously Wrong." It was a 5,000-word deep dive, and it landed like a thunderclap. I have spent the last decade arguing for less government intervention in the tech sector, Reed began. I believe in competition, in permissionless innovation, and in the power of the market to sort winners from losers. It is from this philosophical standpoint that I must state unequivocally, what happened to Leo Castillo was an abomination, and Section 217B is not a free market tool. It is a weapon of corporate socialism. He didn't praise Crockett or the Democrats. He ignored the partisan framing entirely. Instead, he did what no one else could do. He broke down the technical evidence for his highly informed audience. He analyzed the code, not just the LOL, but the deeper architectural similarities, explaining with brutal clarity that the probability of convergent development on this scale was statistically zero. This wasn't two people inventing the light bulb at the same time. This was someone stealing a light bulb and claiming they'd invented it. Then, he turned his fire on the law itself. A free market is a level playing field, Reed wrote. Section 217B does not level the field. It tilts it in favor of the incumbent. It is a government-created mechanism that socializes the risk of innovation. Let the little guys spend their time and money creating something new, while privatizing the reward if they succeed. Let the big guys take it. This is not capitalism. It is cronyism. It is a handout to the politically connected, dressed up in the language of patriotism. Senator Lee claims this is about competing with China. Does he truly believe the best way to beat an authoritarian state is to mimic its top-down, state-directed industrial policy? True American innovation comes from the garage, the dorm room, the lone genius. It comes from Leo Castillo, and the government's only role should be to protect his property, his intellectual property, to help a bigger company steal it. The effect was immediate and seismic. Declan Reed had given the conservative and libertarian base permission to be outraged. He had reframed the issue, taking it away from the left versus right cage and placing it into a framework of principle versus corruption. The comments on Lee's social media feeds, which had been uniformly supportive, were now flooded with angry messages from his own followers. Quoting Reed's blog post, the intellectual foundation of his counterattack had been demolished by a voice his own side trusted. The narrative had been recaptured, with the public debate reset on favorable ground. Jasmine Crockett knew it was time for the final act. She had her staff book a room in the National Press Club. She also booked a plane ticket for one Leo Castillo from Salt Lake City to Washington, D.C. WHEN, she stepped to the podium. She was not alone. Leo stood beside her, looking nervous but resolute. In a new suit he'd bought for the occasion, the room was packed. Crockett began not with an attack, but with a statement of principle. 2 weeks ago, in a committee hearing, I used some strong words to describe a piece of legislation. She started, her voice calm and measured. I called it a getaway car for corporate pirates. I stand by that description. But today, I don't. Want to talk about the crime? I want to talk about what we need to build in its place, because this issue is not, and should never be, a partisan one. She looked over at Leo. The man standing next to me, Leo Castillo, is an innovator. He created something new and brilliant. In a functioning fair system, he would have had the opportunity to bring his creation to the world, to succeed or fail, on its own merits. But that's not what happened. The system he encountered was not a free market. It was a rigged game, with the rules written by the very people he was forced to compete against. The right to own what you create, whether it's a plot of land, a small business, or a piece of code, is fundamental. It is the engine of our prosperity and the foundation of the American dream. We do not make America stronger by rigging the game for the biggest players. We make it stronger by ensuring everyone, from a tech giant in a corporate campus to a coder in a Provo apartment, gets to play by the same rules. She then held up a thin document. That is why today I am introducing a new piece of legislation called the Digital Creators Bill of Rights. This bill will, first and foremost, repeal Section 217B of the AICA. It will strengthen protections for independent inventors, and it will increase transparency in the legislative process to ensure that corporations can't secretly write their own loopholes into our laws. This is not a Democratic or Republican idea. It's an American one. And I invite my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including Senator Lee, to join me in supporting it. It was a masterful move. She had risen above the political fray, championed a universally appealing principle, and offered a concrete solution, all while giving her opponents a chance to join her and save face. She had defined the entire conflict on her terms. 1 month after the hearing, the world had changed for everyone involved. Nexus Innovations, facing a PR nightmare and a shareholder revolt, fired Julian Vance. Under new leadership, they entered into settlement negotiations with Leo's new high-powered legal team. The resulting settlement was confidential, but its effects were not. As part of the deal, Nexus was forced to issue a public statement acknowledging Leo Castillo as the original architect of the sorting algorithm and, 2, licensed the technology from him going forward. Leo didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. He used the settlement to launch the Castillo Foundation for Innovator Rights, a nonprofit dedicated to providing free legal resources to independent inventors and creators locked in battles with corporate giants. He was back in his apartment, but this time he was working on an open-source project, collaborating with developers from around the world. His work now protected by the very public profile he had never sought. The lasting echo of Jasmine Crockett's fight rippled out in ways she would never see. In a small architectural firm in Chicago, a young designer named Sarah was watching a recap of the press conference on her lunch break. For 6 months, she had been in a quiet, hopeless dispute with a former employer, a large construction firm, that had used her award-winning design for a community center without credit or compensation, claiming it was work for hire, even though she had developed it before her contract began. She had been told by a lawyer that fighting them would be too expensive, that she should just move on. Watching Crockett stand with Leo, hearing the words, "the right to own what you create," something shifted in her. The fight wasn't just about her design anymore, it was about a principle. Her hopelessness burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She picked up her phone, found the number for a different lawyer, a litigator, known for taking on tough cases, and pressed call. The fight wasn't over. For so many people, it was just beginning. What does it truly mean to own an idea in the digital age? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the people fighting for change.